Hello, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the EU Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Conference. You will see today, you're now watching on the main stage, the artificial intelligence session. What you'll see on your right side of the screen, you will be able to pick the, you will see the Q&A session where you can input your questions. Please pick the green dot that says artificial intelligence, so you'll send it to this session. On the top of your video, you will see a little line saying main stage. Should you at any point wish to watch the biological weapons session, you can click on that main stage and it will also appear a tab saying breakout session. If you click on breakout session, then you'll watch the biological session and you can switch between the two throughout the whole session. Enjoy the conference.
Hello, good morning from Berlin and a warm welcome to the breakout session on the impact of AI and related technologies, what role for arms control. This title covers quite a lot of ground. We are going to talk about lethal autonomous weapons, about arms control option for those weapons, especially with regard to meaningful human control. We will take a look at other military applications of artificial intelligence, and we are also looking at the options or the benefits, potential benefits of artificial intelligence for arms control. And to do this, I am very happy to have three distinguished panelists with me today, three experts that have a vast knowledge on those issues. My name is Anja Dahlmann. I am a researcher at the Berlin-based think tank Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. I'm going to introduce the speakers in the order they are going to speak today. And we will start with Guglielmo Tamburrini. He is a professor at the University of Naples for philosophy and science. He's also a member of ICRAC, the International Committee on Arms Control for Robots. That's the wrong order, I'm sorry, you get the gist. He will talk to us about lethal autonomous weapons and especially meaningful human control as a way to address those weapons systems. He will be followed by Pauline Warnotte. Pauline is a researcher at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR, and previously she served in the Belgian Armed Forces in the Law Unit on International and Humanitarian Law. And third, we'll be speaking Ruediger Bohn from the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He is the Deputy Federal Government Commissioner for Disarmament and Arms Control. Pauline will address the toolbox of arms control for AI and especially laws, and Ambassador Bohn will give us a more general perspective, picking up autonomous weapons and other issues. And I'm very much looking forward to the presentations and the discussion. Afterwards, I'm going to, I might ask some of my own questions, but especially look into the chat to see which questions you as the audience have. So all grab your coffee or tea and let's jump right in with Guglielmo and meaningful human control. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for this invitation and great opportunity to share ideas and discuss this issue together. I'm trying to share screen, but I cannot do that. So I will, I hope that someone will do that for me because I cannot share screen while the other participant is sharing. Okay, probably now I can do that. Yeah, okay. Yeah, let's see if I can share this. Okay. All right. Can you see my screen? Yes. Okay. Very well. So so I will focus definitely on autonomous weapon systems, starting from the observation that there is widespread convergence, as we heard already yesterday, CCW in Geneva and other international fora that imposing meaningful human control on the targeting and attack engagement functions of a weapon system is very important, is necessary. And this is more so necessary since AI is putting these critical functions in the purview of weapon systems, of machines. There is no time to review all conceptions of what is meaningful human control. What I will end up with is to propose one avenue which seems to me promising for political or even for legally binding instruments, which has these three properties. Is a principled approach, emphasizing respect of international humanitarian law, accountability, and also respect for human dignity. It's prudential because it requires by default higher levels of human control in target selection and attack, and is differentiated in the sense that it admits is based on the belief that not one size of meaningful human control does not fit all weapon systems, and so that we have to suitably differentiate this approach. Let me, since this is the EU conference, let me recall the European Parliament resolution. The European Parliament resolution speaks about of 2018, concentrates on lethal autonomous weapon systems, and calls for ensuring meaningful human control over the critical functions. Similar proposals were made in the context of the CCW conference by Austria, Brazil, and Chile in 2018, and there have been many more declarations in this sense. And look, the important thing in the first sentence is meaningful human control, including during deployment. So the European view expressed here is that you cannot exhaust meaningful human control at the stage of planning a mission or even designing the system. During deployment, human control must be there. And also it takes a very strong view, in the sense that aims the European Parliament to a legally binding instrument, prohibiting lethal autonomous weapons, which essentially are understood as weapons without meaningful human control. Why is meaningful human control so important? I think that one picture tells you more than 100 words. This is an AI classification, learning classification system, which learn to classify many objects from visual images. For example, school buses or certain animals like ostrich, okay? So on the left-hand side, you see a picture of a school bus, which was correctly classified by this system. Then you insert a certain small perturbation, which is here magnified 10 times, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to see it, to detect it. This is superimposed to the first left-hand side picture to result into the right-hand side picture of the school bus, okay? Well, what happens? For us, there is nothing, no difference. We still recognize it as a school bus. We are robust to this. Well, the system classified it as an ostrich. And there is a big difference from an IHL perspective, because the school bus is definitely something protected under the principle of distinction, while an ostrich is not. So I think this tells you very well why, of course, humans cannot be a perfect fail-safe system, but they can be very helpful to patch up for insufficiencies of current AI systems, and probably for systems that will be in the future very much like that. Okay, so this is the worry, and the worry, of course, brought about a number of more reflective considerations about autonomous weapon systems. And here I see on the left-hand side, of course, there are three very important and specific things about the autonomy of machines in warfare: violations of international humanitarian law, and especially the distinction proportionality principles, the possibility that since a machine is has elements of unpredictability, especially in hectic and erratic and surprise-seeking warfare environments, you may have an accountability gap for things that machine can do and would count as war crimes if they were perpetrated by humans. And also, if you look at the issue from the side of the possible victims which are who are subject to the judgment of an algorithm, of a machine, in a sense, and you can strongly argue that their human dignity is violated. Of course, there is also another rather specific to autonomous weapon system issue about the arms control and about the arms race and the possibility of threatening international peace and stability is the pace of war, because machines interacting among them from the same side or from opposing side may bring very easily the pace of war beyond any possibility of human cognitive capacity, control, and reaction times. Of course, you have to take into account also what is on the right-hand side, which are possible advantages in a certain sense within the evil scenario of a war. You have greater precision from AI instruments, and there are ethical underpinnings for this, because you may potentially reduce some victims locally and lower risk to military personnel. There are ethical reasons also supporting these things. So what is, I think, and then, basically I come to the end of my talk, this idea of trying to making more precise the sense of what is really a meaningful human control. Okay, I believe that the highest objective for us is for everybody is to preserve international humanitarian law, accountability, and also to preserve and to protect human dignity. Therefore, I would suggest that the approach should be prudential, imposing by default the stricter forms of human control. Essentially, by default, in the absence of other observations to the contrary, humans in the control loop must select the targets either directly or under machine suggestion. But of course, what happens is that the objection has been made that in some cases, for example, about antimaterial, so in a certain sense, or at least in the intended usage, not lethal weapon systems, this would not be possible. And also maybe, if you think about deliberate targeting in very structured environments, like in high seas or in other situations in which this scenario, the context, does not change very rapidly in ways that the machines would not be able to capture and then to function properly, then probably you may have in this deliberate targeting, like high seas, a lower level of human control. But at least so the exceptions should be admitted, but exceptions to a rule adopted by default. And these exceptions should be internationally agreed upon by the states, so that there should be a consensus about that. But at least I believe that full autonomy should be excluded, in the sense that humans should always retain override privileges to abort weapons, target selection and attack. And also that you cannot exert this meaningful human control by restricting yourself to the design and mission planning stages only. Principle be essentially, and this is the final point, because you have to ensure that certain functions for humans, to be able to contribute to fail-safe functions, since we have seen the failures of AI systems, humans have to be attractors for accountability. You cannot have accountability gaps. And the third point is very important for human dignity protection concerns, is that humans should be moral agency and actors, making sure that certain very heavy and difficult decisions are taken by humans and not by machines. Okay, I'm done, and I think, well, maybe, yeah, a couple of minutes more than I should have to.
Perfectly fine, brilliant. Thank you very much, Guglielmo. Maybe later on we can discuss a bit more what human or meaningful human control actually means and how that might be operationalized. Our next speakers might address that actually. If not, we will pick that up in the discussion after the two other presentations. And now we're going to hear from Pauline.
Thank you very much, Anja, and I would like to thank the organizer for the pleasure and the honor to speak today among such distinguished moderator and panelists. And for this second intervention of the panel, and after a very enlightening and inspiring presentation by Professor Tamburrini, I will briefly address in my personal capacity some of the guiding questions that were submitted by the organizers on the role of arms control with regard to artificial intelligence and related technologies. And I would like first to note that while I will refer to military artificial intelligence, it should be kept in mind that artificial intelligence comprises a vast number of fields, including robotics and knowledge representation and reasoning, and that this also encompasses both handcrafted expert knowledge systems and machine learning. Military application of AI, furthermore, and should be kept in mind, concern offensive system, kinetic or otherwise adversarial, non-offensive systems, and AI systems supporting decision-making in the broader planification of military operation. And each of these type of military AI raises specific ethical concerns, but also legal questions requiring a tailored and detailed answer. That being said, and during my I think 9 minutes intervention, I will focus on 3 topics. First, fully autonomous weapon system, and I will add a little bit more to the legal dimension to than the technical and the ethical one that have already been discussed by Professor Tamburrini. Second, international arms control arrangements regarding military AI. And third, the EU ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI, and more broadly, the ethical regulation of AI and its military use. Turning now to the first question, I would like to briefly add to what has been brightly explained by Professor Tamburrini on the important aspect of laws, that is the legal one. And the EU guidelines acknowledge that many of the ethical principles that they identify are to a large extent already reflected in existing legal requirements for which mandatory compliance is required. Innovations regarding AI therefore does not operate in a legal vacuum, and indeed, the next to the obligation to respect IHL in the conduct of hostilities, states are also required under international law, notably to legally review new weapons, means and method of warfare. And one can also assume that states that would have adopted themselves domestic rules and policies on AI or machine learning, for instance, to support decision-making derived from the international obligations, would comply with those requirements. Legal obligations apply to the use of fully autonomous weapon systems, but also to the development of those systems. And if these systems have developed, one must assume that a legality test has been conducted ahead of their deployment in the field, as required by the obligation for state to conduct a legal review of any new weapon. This obligation, enshrined in Article 36 of the first additional protocol to the Geneva Convention, has also been recalled numerous times in the framework, notably of the GGN laws. Technical and ethical considerations having an impact on the legality of the use of fully autonomous weapon system must therefore be addressed by any state developing such weapon system before their use. Furthermore, the scope of this obligation is very broad, as it imposes for states to consider in their legal assessment not only IHL, but any international law obligations that are applicable to them, including international criminal law. And one can also assume that states will not develop or allow the development of weapons in contravention to their domestic legislation. Therefore, as early at the design and later development stage, applicable international law and arrangement should be taken into consideration to guarantee a satisfying development of military AI. This leads me to, of course, my second point on international arms control arrangements. The question that was asked by the organizer refers to the feasibility of such arrangements regarding military AI. And well, while I'm very convinced that almost everything is feasible in this area, I'm also quite sure that the same challenges will be faced than in other arms control arrangements. Delimiting the scope of state obligation, implementing these obligations into domestic system, ensuring a minimal level of transparency, notably through reporting and any other form of confidence building measures, including a possible verification mechanism aiming at ensuring mutual trust or even early warning. All of this can be summarized in the imperative of ensuring the efficiency of the measures encompassed into those arrangements. But aside from the legally binding arrangements, other instruments can be and indeed are adopted and are forming an integral part of the so-called disarmament toolbox. And I will therefore now turn to the last point of this short presentation and briefly address the relevance of the EU ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI. First, I would like to note that those guidelines are fortunately not isolated in clouds of initiatives aiming at the governance of military AI. And we witness, I'm sure you already noticed, the blooming of an exponential number of standards, codes of conduct, but also guidelines, procedures, and other principles that are developed, notably by the private sectors, national agency, and international organization. But there is no consistency in this approach, as also a very huge lack of homogeneity in the AI regulation or governance. Nevertheless, I would like to point that there are some salient points, if not common elements. First is the reference to the mandatory compliance with international law. Second, the notion of responsibility and accountability in the design, but also in the development phase, and later the use of those military AI. Third, the necessity for AI to meet qualitative criteria or standards, although they are addressed under various concepts such as robustness, security, transparency, compliance, explainability, predictability. And fourth, also the need to conduct testing, verification, and periodical review of both the system, but also the principles themselves. The EU guidelines are no exception, and they are indeed a very valuable document to guide the development of AI, including in the military domain. As to know whether they are a way towards a regulation of military AI, and similarly to the other initiative, they are indeed as a possible way of, I think, moving forward in the development of a relevant and viable broader framework. And they are complementary also to international law and to other measures that are driven by international organizations, national governments, and notably the private sector. And they will build a mutually reinforcing and comprehensive set of rules for military AI governance, at least I believe. Therefore, and to my opinion, the EU guidelines can be seen as a median way that would currently allow to navigate between what is legally authorized, technically achievable or feasible, and socially also acceptable, which is really important when we are speaking about military AI. But they nevertheless, to my opinion, need to be understood and implemented. And I would like here to conclude this presentation by making some very short remarks on how to ensure the coherence and the relevance of a global governance mechanism for military AI as part of this disarmament toolbox. So the development of such mechanism, but also its adoption and implementation should the government authority, but also the final users to understand those guidelines and other regulation mechanisms. Second, principles should cover the whole life cycle, and it has been highlighted by Professor Tamburrini. So the whole life cycle of the system, going from the design level to the development phase, but including also validation of the system, verification, testing, evaluation, pre and post deployment of this system. Thirdly, the relevant person should be aware of the content of those principles and guidelines and also trained to implement them. Fourth, a periodical evaluation of those principles should be conducted to ensure their continued relevance, notably regarding the possible evolution of the legal framework. And finally, last but not least, as expressed in the EU guidelines, the emphasis on this mechanism should be put not only on compliance, but also aim at the complete adherence to those guidelines. And I'm very much convinced that the EU has a paramount role to play in this field. I thank you very much for your kind attention. I hope I was not too long.
Okay, perfectly on time. Thank you very much. I also already have a few follow-up questions. We might discuss verification in more detail later, we see. But first, I'd like to hear from Ambassador Bohn what he has to tell us about arms control and artificial intelligence. Floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to speak today on behalf of my government here at this panel. The military use of artificial intelligence continues to be very high on the agenda of the arms control community, and it remains very high on our agenda here in Berlin. I guess some of you participated in our conference, Capturing Technology, Rethinking Arms Control last week, which was the second conference in a row. So we are about to establish a series of conferences on new technologies and the impact on arms control. And last week during this conference, we saw an overwhelming interest by participants in this topic, in the idea of artificial intelligence in weapon systems. And half of the registered 1,000 participants wanted to be part of this specific breakout sessions. So therefore, I'd like to recap some of the takeaways from these sessions, which was, by the way, chaired by CIPRI, which has, of course, also a leading role here at the EU consortium. So one idea was to look at instruments that also used in the private sector, like certification and auditability for weapon systems that contain artificial intelligence. Another idea was to look at instruments that are used in financial markets. There was this question, can circuit breakers prevent unwanted escalation? And another angle was to look at artificial intelligence weapon systems from the engineering perspective. This idea was mainly put forward by Airbus representatives. And here the question was, can ethics be built into future weapon systems? Is that possible technically? And then there was a takeaway on a more political level. And that was put forward by the ministers that participated in the high-level segment. So there were 5 European ministers that proposed to launch a strategic EU process on new technologies. That goes, of course, beyond artificial intelligence, that would catch anything that makes weapons faster, more autonomous, or more precise. And this idea of an EU strategic process, what is it about? We think such a process could, first of all, help the EU member states to build a joint EU analysis, a joint EU understanding on the repercussions of new technologies for military systems, and to understand the military dimension of AI. Then this EU process could also help to take stock of existing EU instruments and their relationship to new technologies. It could also help the EU to prevent proliferation of new technologies, of military new technologies to, for instance, non-state actors. And the EU could develop joint positions for the respective multilateral fora, joint positions on AI, on lethal autonomous weapon systems, and so on. And ultimately, I think the EU could play a role by preparing the ground for new EU instruments, including for EU standards. So this standard setting power of the EU is, I think, important. In this context, I would also welcome the report launched by CIPRI at the beginning of the month, outlining how the EU could develop best practices on military AI. Maybe I'd like to briefly focus on the German approach to lethal autonomous weapon systems. Of course, the adoption by the CCW of guiding principles and the agreement to work out recommendations for a normative and operational framework until 2021 created positive momentum last year. And unfortunately, we could not retain this momentum this year due to Corona. But Germany pushed for a fully virtual format in Geneva to continue the GGE discussions. But of course, in vain. We still think that we should try to keep up the momentum as much as possible by, for instance, meeting in informal groups or writing non-papers to develop the substance further. For us, it remains important to advance the options for enshrining human control as a principle in close dialogue with industry and science. And in this regard, we as Germany support two formats at the moment. One is a working group on ethical issues set up by Airbus Industries on the FCAS project. FCAS is the new fighter jet project. It's not just a fighter jet, it includes a number of other systems. And then we also support a project with North American robotics industries and science as part of the so-called New Alliance for Human Control, in order to come up with options for multilateral regulations. So we think these multi-stakeholder formats allow us to mobilize more actors, science, industry, to bring in their expertise in formulating global standards. And I think there's a second lesson learned from the GGE process. I think we could start with politically binding principles with soft law and later on build on that. So it's kind of a step-by-step process that can bring us closer to legally binding instruments than in the future. Our goal, of course, remains to fully harness the potential of artificial intelligence for our societies while guarding our ethical values, international law, and global stability. So that's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bohn. We already have quite a few questions from the chat that keep coming in, and people are voting on them, so we can see which question is especially popular. And yes, there's one with two supporters, I would say, and I think it's a very interesting question where many of you might have to say something about, and it, I think, touches also on the requirements for meaningful human control. I'm going to read it out by Jasmin Haunschild. In a culture of data-driven decision-making, how can we ensure that there is a real space to override algorithmic advice in human on, oh, things are switching here, sorry, human in the loop scenarios, on the loop scenarios? I think it's a very interesting question. Would you like to jump right into that discussion, Pauline or Guglielmo, whoever wants to go first?
If you wish, yes. I think it's a very, very interesting question. And in a certain sense, I don't think there is any way to ensure that, but we can take many measures to try and mitigate the occurrence of this problem. One is a very general cultural issue. There is a lot of hype around artificial intelligence. And, you know, it was only a very small example that I put forward to try to emphasize that there are strong limitations to what an AI system can do. And as Pauline also emphasized before, AI has to do also with reasoning, with understanding, with explaining. These systems are not capable of doing that. These systems are very good at pattern matching, at sort of classifying different kinds of objects, and so produce, from that point of view, a lot of good results. Can do many tasks, but they are not up to to many important intellectual and cognitive and perceptual tasks that are needed in warfare scenarios. So understanding this hype is a first important initial step, but also, of course, there is a lot of training also, which has to be done specifically within the military to avoid the bias in favor of machine decisions. Because of course humans can feel very much the pressure when a machine tells you that certain outcome is true, to contest that outcome. But we have the many stories, starting from Colonel Petrov's story back in the USSR, that tell how important is the role of humans in that, not to overtrust machines. And of course, then also the temporal gap, but that's a very difficult issue to address. And that should be also regulated. There should be that the pace of war should not go beyond human possibility of getting into with overriding somehow. But that's of course the possibilities there in or on the loop.
Right. So fighting at machine speed, for example, would be an issue.
Yeah.
Here. Yes. Okay. Pauline, would you like to follow up on that?
Yes, thank you. I very much agree with what has been said by Professor Tamburrini, and I would just like some few points. So first of all, there is a need to understand the machine, but how it works, but also what it cannot do. And I think that the final user should have a full understanding, not of the machine functioning maybe, but what he can expect from the machine to do and also not be able to do. And this is a mutual dialogue. The person that are developing that kind of machine must also understand what is the operational circumstances where it will be used and what will be the state of mind of the people when they will use that kind of machine. So I think that this mutual dialogue, that's why I was speaking also about involving the final user into the development of those guidelines. So this mutual dialogue is very important. And of course, at the top of that, you have the training, because this is only when you are training to use, you are trained to use that kind of a system that you can understand if you can rely on the system, not rely on the system. So this is not something that you put into the hands of a final user, and otherwise you have the risk either, as has been said, to have the bias to over rely on the functioning of the machine or to under rely on this functioning. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question, there are a lot of questions in the chat, so I'm just going to cherry pick from them. The next question I'd like to address first to Ambassador Bohn, who has a vast knowledge of arms control processes. And it is, what do you think would be the impact of autonomous weapons on short or long-term international stability and geopolitical dynamics such as crisis, escalation? So what is your impression? How do maybe arms dynamics have an influence at the moment? Do you see that on the international level, and maybe also looking at the broader arms control and international stability scene at the moment? How does that fit in there? Does it have an impact?
Yeah. Thank you. I would go a little bit beyond the idea of artificial intelligence. I think new technologies in general will influence the nature of warfare, and they can change the nature of warfare and also change strategic stability. One example are, for instance, hypersonic missiles or other missiles that become more and more precise. And these systems can, in a way, replace a manned aircraft. So countries that cannot afford good aircraft can afford missile systems and can be part of the game, so they can change the calculus, so to speak. And in this regard, all new technologies, not just artificial intelligence, also hypersonic speed systems and so on, as I said, things that make weapons more precise, more autonomous, and faster, are a challenge to international law and to arms control arrangements. I see one way to deal with these challenges by completely rethinking arms control. I mean, we currently still live in a world where we count weapon systems and try to put limits to weapon systems, to tanks, to aircraft, and what have you. And I see that in the future we move more to a world where arms control will be more based on, will have a behavior-based approaches, not object-based approaches, but behavior-based approaches. We are already discussing these approaches if it comes to arms control in outer space, where we discuss certain prohibitive norms and standards, for instance, not to come too close with one satellite to another satellite. So this is what I mean by behaviors. The same is true for the cyberspace, where we cannot count or should not count computers or servers or whatsoever. We have to define behavior that is in keeping with international law, and that is of course a challenge sometimes to understand and to define what is an aggression in cyberspace, where does it start, where can we reciprocate an attack, and so on. But again, this idea of behavior-based approaches is, I think, the future of arms control for artificial intelligence, but also for new technologies in general. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you, Pauline or Guglielmo, would you like to follow up on the original question or also on this behavior-based approaches to arms control, which is a very exciting topic as well?
Yeah, may I add something? Just, of course, there is the issue about the autonomous weapons lowering the threshold of going to war, decision to go to war, because there will be less human casualties on the part of those who have and deploy these systems. So this is a sort of a counter observation with respect to the idea that greater AI precision, if it will ever be delivered, may bring it locally in individual battlefields less victims, bring about less victims. But in the wider scenario of stability, may lower the threshold for this is a direct but there are also indirect effects. It's a pity that so far a more holistic approach to discussing autonomy in weapon systems has not been undertaken. For example, it should be definitely discussed, this issue together jointly with the cybersecurity problem, because AI there has two roles. On the one hand, new AI tools based on machine learning are being developed to find vulnerabilities in computer systems, in hardware and software, and so can really speed up the problem of cyber attacks. And also the same AI systems, autonomous weapons or not, can be hacked. And so they can bring about undesired effects of another kind. And there are a few other items that should be mentioned. So I definitely think that there are special threats to international stability coming from these technological developments.
So if I may just add, because this also raised a whole range of very interesting questions, just add a few things. I'm very seduced by the behavior-based approach mentioned by Ambassador Bohn. And I would like to note that regarding the use of autonomous weapon system, this is very interesting because at first it was, the idea was developed to keep the control on the system, and then later we moved to the control on the use of force, not the system itself, but the use of force. And this is where also the whole life cycle approach was put on the table and discussed. And this is also when it was discussed that the final use is not sufficient, and there should be a consideration of this whole life cycle approach, and meaningful human control can appear at any stage and must appear at any stage of the development of that kind of weapon system. This also brings me to consideration, and I've read that there was a very interesting question in the chat that I do not see anymore, from Mr. Eugenio Benincasa, about the possible need to reframe the jus ad bellum regarding the development of new technology. And I think that this is something that we sometimes hear in this debate. Is IHL or is international law adapted to those new weapons, and should international law be adapted to fight with the challenges that are raised with, to meet the challenges that are raised with those new weapons? And I think that this is taking the problem the other way around, because of those new weapons have to respect the law that is already in place. And this is why legal review is very important, because of it's the development of that kind of weapon requires the evaluation of their legality at the earliest stage. And so the problem is really the other way around. So first of all, you have to consider what is legally possible, then develop the system accordingly, and not develop a system and then ask how you can fit it into the legally binding and possibly not binding instruments that are already adopted by states. And I think that this argument that we often hear, that international law is not sufficient to deal with that kind of system, is really shedding a kind of shadow into this legal framework that is already put in place and that must be respected by the development, by the new weapons that are in the development of new weapons, which doesn't prevent states to adopt other measures to make sure that there is a common understanding of what this international law that is already in place and based on very basic principles, notably for the conduct of hostilities. So to develop a new regulatory framework to make sure that those principles are correctly translated into the weapon system that would be developed.
Thank you. Again, so many possible follow-up questions on that. But I'm going to stick to legal reviews, or the relation of technology development and legal frameworks there, because I think we have two questions in the chat that fit right into that. And one is by Maurizio Martellini. Why do not set policy norms on machine learning? You can't see that on your screen, you speakers, but I can see it here. So why not set norms on machine learning, policy norms? And then by my colleague Betty Sue, regarding multi-stakeholder approaches, how can the private sector and defense industry be engaged for formulating and implementing normative standards? So how can we talk to them early on to discuss, for example, the requirements of IHL, but maybe also ethical questions there? Ambassador Bohn already mentioned this working group by Airbus. I'm also a member of that group. But I think there are other aspects of that technology that might be engaged. So whoever wants to jump in on that first. Ambassador Bohn, yes.
Yeah, thank you. Regarding the idea to bring in industries into the discussion, I think it's important to notice that companies like Airbus Industries and others have, at least in democratic Western countries, an interest in being part of this discussion on ethical norms and their weapon systems. That may be different than other countries, but I clearly feel that the Airbus Industries, for instance, they have an interest in becoming part of the discussion because they feel the pressure also from civil societies to legitimize their systems and to make clear that their weapon systems are in line with ethical and legal norms. And of course, that helps to some extent. And then, as I said, I think we cannot develop norms and standards without the technical expertise from industries, because these things, unlike in the past, where we could, as I said, count tanks and aircraft. If it comes to AI and new technologies, we need the technical expertise, and we need to cooperate with industries. And I think it's a good approach to develop formal or informal groups where representatives from industry, civil society, and governments meet to discuss technical details of future weapon systems that could then later on be translated in binding norms and standards. But the first step is certainly the exchange on the technical nature of these systems. Otherwise, we cannot really set norms. Maybe one last point. I mentioned behavior-based approaches. Of course, this is only one concept. That is not the answer to all challenges. I also mentioned the notion certification. I think certifying future weapon systems is an important approach. This approach is partly already there, at least in Germany. If our armed forces want to procure a new system, the system has to undergo a kind of a certification process according to, I think it's Article 36 of one of these Geneva protocols. Actually, all countries should do or should undergo this procedure. Not everybody does, but this is the beginning, I think, of a kind of a certification process that could be modified or made more sophisticated in the future. Thank you.
Yes, I would like to emphasize the distance between the cold technological reality and the norms. In the sense that, for example, of course, that the private sector industries or stakeholders should do their best to test thoroughly their systems, for example. But one thing is to test a system which has to go into a factory where you adapt the factory to the limitations of the systems. Another thing is to give a thorough testing of a system which has to work in very unexpected circumstances and erratic circumstances, as the scenarios that one finds often in the battlefield. Okay, so there is a real serious difficulty there, and so that should enhance our propension towards a prudential approach. So that's one thing. The other thing is that Martellini was emphasizing is that, okay, why don't we set up policy norms on machine learning? Machine learning has been wonderful, it performs with an enormous accuracy, sometimes superhuman accuracy, certain tasks. But this is only a statistical evaluation. And the statistical evaluation is different from risk evaluation, because rare accidents, as we know, for example, in the nuclear, even in the civil nuclear domain, can be so devastating that you don't want them ever to occur. So the statistical accuracy, which is heralded for the new machine learning, is not enough in this context. Okay, so it's also very difficult. It's an important, setting norms, but it's very difficult to address and solve.
Yeah, thank you. So I think this question was very, very interesting because of, and I can build on what I already mentioned, that the importance of this mutual dialogue and understanding between the final users, the developers, but also the state, and the obligation and requirement for each of those stakeholders in this area. And this is also building on a preventive approach. And I think that one of the very good examples that we have is actually the GGN laws. Because in the GGN laws, militaries were involved. The industry was also asked to make presentation. There was a continuous dialogue between all those stakeholders that achieved the adoption of the guiding principles. So basically, the guiding principles are mainly saying what was already present, notably in the legislation, because of, as I said, there is no legal vacuum here. We are involving in an area that is already to a certain extent regulated. But now we are speaking about the operationalization of those principles. And this is where the presence of the final users and of the person that already put in place this framework that is pre-existing to the development of those weapons are very important. And Professor Tamburrini mentioned the the difficulties in live testing that kind of weapon. And to this area, there are some examples that should be or could be kept in mind. That is the modelization, for instance, and the certification of non-lethal weapons that was made by NATO. Because of the testing of such weapon also raises some question. Can you test those weapons on persons that are actually persons and living individuals? And so this modelization is one of the possibility, and there are many systems to try to test those weapons even before they are fielded in real life situation. And I think that here again, the EU, as was mentioned by Ambassador Bohn, has a very huge role to play, because there is a common and shared understanding of many issues, but also an area of dialogue that is standing for many decades now, and that would allow to move forward into the discussion of this very important matter, not only for the artificial intelligence and autonomous weapon system, but the development of new technologies in a broader sense, because we will see much more of that, including in the military domain. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our session is coming slowly but surely to an end. I've been told that we might be able to take a few more minutes, but I don't want to stretch it too far. So what I'm taking from, among many other things, taking from this breakout session here is that to capture AI, the military use of AI, and specifically weapons with autonomous functions, is probably a multi-layered approach, starting with more like private sector initiatives and the regular standards for trustworthy AI, for example, and other development standards on the private level, and for example with IEEE. On the EU level, probably also at NATO, when we look closer at the military use. We haven't discussed NATO here, but we only have an hour, so I think that's okay. And then maybe the CCW protocol, or whatever comes out of that process, would be kind of the final piece in that puzzle of many different ways to approach the technology and the responsible use of it with regard to meaningful human control. So one final, very quick round to the speakers. What is your take? Do you think it is feasible that in the end we will have a sufficient regulation of AI in warfare, specifically with regard to targeting and autonomous weapons? Maybe starting in the same order as we had the speakers. So Guglielmo, you first.
Yes, I'm not sure I'm addressing specifically what you are saying, but there was a question that I saw, it disappeared at a certain point. Okay. The issue was, can ethics be built into machine learning AI systems? And I think addressing this question enables us to understand even better the need for meaningful human control, because there you have many bottlenecks to do that. One is the perceptual bottleneck, which I showed you. How can you recognize someone who's protected by the distinction principle, even from unconventional behaviors, and give this operational capability to a machine? Of course, also humans have many problems with that, but it's very difficult to understand how to do that with machines. Then ethics. Ethics is a problem of balancing different principles. It's not one right behavior. So how do you operationalize this thing into a machine? This is a very subtle way of balancing different principles, pulling you in different directions. And the third thing is these machines, as Pauline clearly mentioned, are not like the old AI, capable of providing explanation, being accountable, even accountable not in the sense of being moral subjects, but giving reasons, moral reasons for what they do, because they are associative machines. It's not like that. So there are many difficult problems to be solved. The one should not be taken by hype and should understand that all of these converge on the need for specifying a real meaning of meaningful human control.
Thank you very much. So as I said, I think that almost everything is feasible if you have goodwill to achieve it. But the important notion to keep in mind for me is, first of all, the compliance with the existing regulation first, and with any regulation that would be adapted, adherence to this regulation and efficiency and effectivity into them. And I think that some of the key factors for that is education. Education with this mutual dialogue, education from the stakeholders to what are the needs, but what are also the limitations and the constraints that are put into, for instance, the final users. Awareness raising and knowledge of what already exists and what would be adapted, and training into the use of those machines. Thank you.
Thank you. And the final 2 minutes.
Yeah, I think we are still at the beginning of defining norms and standards for such a complex issue like artificial intelligence. I'm still optimistic that we can make progress. First, in the field of for instance, these autonomous weapon systems, we can first develop soft law, non-legally binding norms. We can later on build on these structures, and then we have to see that things are very much intertwined. The EU, for instance, issued a kind of a white paper or white book on artificial intelligence and their civil applications. And there, this is of course about things like autonomous driving or so. And in this paper, they discuss the issue of liability. And if we translate that into the military sphere, then I would say liability is in the military sphere is accountability. So things are very similar, and we have to keep also the civil dimension of artificial intelligence and new technologies. We have to keep that next to our deliberations on the military dimension, and try also to combine the two issues, and to see how we can find norms and standards for these new technologies in general. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you. I think it's a brilliant way to start the day with such distinguished and smart people on the panel. So taking away from this, there's a lot of to do to capture military use of AI, but in the end, it seems to be possible. So a positive outlook on that. And with that, thank you again. Thank you to the audience for your questions. I wish you a good day. And now we have a break until 10:15, and then back to the plenary sessions. Thank you very much. Bye.